For the last several years, we've seen tens of thousands of people illegally cross the US-Canada border and subsequently claim asylum after already having reached upstate New York. This, of course, is the Roxham Road border crossing, and many of you have written into my office over the last several days to discuss the issue of this border crossing in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the Prime Minister did make an announcement about this today, but before I get to that, I just want to remind you how we got here. It all started at the beginning of 2017 with this #WelcomeToCanada tweet. Watch what happened after that.
The public deserves to know how many people are illegally crossing the border into Canada.
How many?
Covering up these numbers won't make the problems go away for the Liberals. So without these numbers, local officials can't plan to cope with the situation, and the government can't be held to account by us. So if, as the Liberals claim, there's no problem and there's nothing to see here, why are they telling the RCMP to hide these numbers?
Honourable Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Mr. Speaker, Manitoba has started to use a facility which is supposed to help hold Canadian seniors as an emergency measure to deal with the huge influx of illegal border crossers. The community of Gretna and the entire province is furious because the Liberal government is doing nothing to stop this problem. Given that the Manitoba government is now requesting millions of tax dollars to deal with this situation, will the Prime Minister close the loophole on the Safe Third Country Agreement, stop this problem, and ensure that asylum seekers enter Canada through legal means?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, Canada's refugee system has been lauded around the world for being one of the most compassionate and efficient. Mr. Speaker, we laud the generosity of Canadians in border communities as they assist these asylum seekers. We have an independent board, the Immigration Refugee Board, that assesses each and every case on its merits, and if those people do not have a good case, they get to be removed as per the law. We are committed to our international obligations to give each and everyone who claims asylum due process and a fair hearing.
Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
The minister makes it sound like Canadians aren't generous if they simply stand up for their right to have our border integrity secured. Recent media reports have said that over half of the illegal border crossers have serious criminal records. This puts CBSA, RCMP, and community members in the area, their safety at risk, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, my question is very clear. There's a way that we can stop this, and it's by closing the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement. Why has this minister failed to act?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Agreement numerous times, but I'll now quote the head of the UNHCR in Canada. I really think that the conditions which prevailed at the time of the drafting and the adoption of the Safe Third Country Agreement in 2004 are the same as they are today, and it will be difficult to change a policy that is seen as good cooperation, good responsibility sharing between two systems that have the same values and the same procedural guarantees. As far as the asylum system is concerned in the United States, legally speaking, we have not seen a change. That is the UNHCR representative in Canada.
The Prime Minister has done nothing to address, and that's the issue of illegal border crossers at Canada's U.S. land border. These people are flooding across the border. Our border services agents are feeling the pinch, and community members are actually starting to feel frightened about the level of people that are coming across. Will the Prime Minister commit today to giving people the tools that they need by closing the loophole on the Safe Third Country Agreement, preventing this problem from occurring this summer?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
While the rest of the world closes off its borders against newcomers, we're proud that Canadians have continued to be welcoming and opening. Unfortunately, the Conservative Party is showing its roots of being fearful and closed in. We know it's important to defend our immigration system, to ensure the integrity of our borders. That's why we're ensuring that police officers and border service agencies have the resources they need to do their work. We will continue to defend Canadians' rights, security, and the openness that we know is a tremendous advantage and value for our country.
Two Conservative MPs are calling on the Liberal government to do more to deal with the influx of asylum seekers crossing the border into Manitoba.
Provencher MP Ted Falk and immigration critic Michelle Rempel held a media conference near Emerson this morning.
They're calling on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to do more to deal with this issue and close the loophole which allows asylum seekers to cross the border illegally.
Political battle lines are also being drawn over immigration in Emerson, Manitoba, a small border town that for months has been a major magnet for asylum seekers. Today, federal opposition politicians visited the community where resources and patience are running thin.
We need to protect the integrity of our borders.
And it's incumbent upon the Prime Minister to say this is unsafe and this should not be happening. Support. We know that this issue is placing a strain on provincial resources. So that's why we firmly believe that in order for this problem to be permanently stopped, the government, through Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, must close the loophole in the U.S.-Canada Safe Third Country Agreement that allows people to illegally cross the border and still make an asylum claim.
Mr. Speaker, there are motions in front of the Immigration Committee to study the illegal border crossing crisis. This urgent situation is straining resources of the RCMP, the CBSA, provincial housing, legal aid, and healthcare services. So Canadians are confused as to why the Liberals shut down debate not once but twice on this matter. So can the chair of the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration please update Canadians as to when this urgent matter will be debated at committee, or are the Liberals just going to keep shutting it down over and over again?
Honourable Chair.
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member knows well, it's the committee itself which decides what studies to study and which studies they will study in the future. Presently, we're studying immigration consultants, an issue of tremendous importance, and then the House mandated us to do an Atlantic immigration study, which we will be doing throughout the rest of this session and into the fall. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Calgary-Nose Hill.
That many Canadians won't be satisfied with that answer. But, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister could be doing many things to address this issue, including closing the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement. Instead, the Liberals have announced a whole, wait for it, $30,000 for first responders in Manitoba. For those counting, that's a whopping $609 more than they just spent on Broadway tickets for wealthy investment bankers, Mr. Speaker. So my question simply is this: can the Prime Minister stand up and tell Canadians why his priority is Broadway and not the border?
Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, our priority is applying Canadian law and keeping Canadians safe. In fact, crossing the border in an irregular fashion is no free ticket to Canada. Those people are apprehended. They are identified biographically and biometrically. Their information is checked against all data systems in Canada as well as internationally. If there's a danger, they are detained. They go before the IRB to hear their claims, and if their claims cannot be justified, then deportation proceedings are commenced. The law is applied as are Canadian treaties.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm seeking leave for adjournment of the House for the purpose of discussing an important matter requiring urgent consideration pursuant to Standing Order 52. And this is with regard to the dramatic increase in asylum seekers at our U.S.-Canadian land border. Over recent months, we've seen a dramatic rise in people crossing the border illegally. And this has placed a strain on the RCMP, the CBSA, as well as provincial resources with regard to affordable housing, legal aid, and healthcare services. Recent reports have shown that 2017 we're on track to see a doubling of the amount of asylum seekers in Canada. This would be an all-time record high. Mr. Speaker, Canada is a very open and welcoming country, but we also want to make sure that we have a plan in place to make sure that our borders are secure and that people who are coming to Canada that are seeking asylum, that there's a broader plan in place with regard to resourcing. To date, we've not seen a response from the government on this, and given that we're heading into the summer months and we're going to see an increase in this situation, which is becoming more and more urgent, I feel that it's incumbent upon the House to debate this matter so that we can move on with coming up with a plan. Thank you.
Thank you, member for Calgary-Nose Hill for raising this matter. However, I do not find that it meets the exigencies of the standing order. Orders of the member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Speaker, reports released yesterday show that Canada is on track to receive double the amount of asylum claims in 2017 than it did last year. Many of these claimants will enter Canada by illegally crossing the U.S.-Canada land border. This is a record high, and using 2013 as a benchmark, only 38% of these asylum claims will be accepted as valid. When will the Prime Minister finally act to stem the flow of illegal border crossers so that Canada's resources can be better directed to support the world's most vulnerable? An explosive report shows that in the last 18 months, Canada has seen a massive spike in asylum claims that will cost taxpayers a staggering $2.97 billion in welfare payments that have not been budgeted for. By doing things like lifting the Mexican visa requirement and turning a blind eye to the illegal border crossing crisis, the Liberals have created a huge processing backlog, failing both taxpayers and the world's most vulnerable alike. How is the Prime Minister going to pay for his #Welcome to Canada, #fail?
For Calgary Nose Hill.
Mr. Speaker, today is World Refugee Day, and on behalf of the Conservative Party of Canada, I call upon the Liberals to immediately develop a fully costed, transparent, sustainable plan to provide integration support for refugees, and in doing so, stop simply offloading costs for long-term refugee support to the provinces. Address the massive 45,000 case backlog of privately sponsored refugees. Establish a permanent standing subcommittee regarding internally displaced persecuted groups. Address the severe crisis in asylum claim processing times at the IRB. Stop turning a blind eye to the border crossing crisis in places such as Emerson, Manitoba. Pressure the United Nations to eliminate institutionalized discrimination of persecuted minorities within the refugee selection process. Make the Rainbow Refugee Assistance Program, established under our former Conservative government, a regular, ongoing program. On World Refugee Day, I affirm that the Conservative Party of Canada will continue to be a voice for the protection of human rights and the world's most vulnerable.
One person watching this closely is Michelle Rempel, who is the Conservative MP, Calgary Nose Hill. She's the immigration critic for the official opposition. We find Ms. Rempel in Calgary this morning. Hey, thanks for taking our call.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Tell me about this memo, first of all, with CBSA, before we get into kind of the general border crossing. What's the skinny on this?
So what the RCMP have done here is acknowledge that they need to have a protocol, like a formal protocol in place to deal with Haitian asylum seekers that are illegally crossing the border from the U.S. who have been found in possession of child pornography. What's concerning for me is that in that memo, if you read it, it actually says that there are instances where if the RCMP seizes the pornographic material, that the asylum claim can still proceed.
Yeah, I couldn't believe this. The memo said 4 or 5 refugee claimants from Haiti were found in possession of child pornography, which would be criminal in Canada. Sometimes they are processed for charges. Other times the RCMP just seizes the pornography and the person moves on to make a refugee claim?
That's correct.
What do you think of that?
Well, for months, John, I've been banging my head against the wall in the House of Commons saying, this situation is only going to get worse. It started in earnest in January after the immigration executive order was made in the United States, and then Justin Trudeau tweeted out, #Welcome to Canada. Now, for anyone listening, I want to state firmly that Canada should be an open and welcoming country for those that are in need. When we were in government under in the Conservative Party, we had a very orderly and compassionate asylum claim system. That tweet essentially erased the border. Since that point in time, we've seen a massive spike in people illegally crossing the border to make asylum claims. The Prime Minister refuses to come out and say that, first of all, this is unsafe. I grew up in southern Manitoba. I know what it means to be out in the field in -30 weather. We actually saw someone freeze to death trying to do this. He hasn't said that. And then the second thing is he needs to say this is illegal and that people who want to come to Canada should be entering the country through proper channels and using the process that we have in place to access the country. What's happened here, like what we're talking about today, the child pornography issue, there's been reports in recent months of people who originate from Somalia, who have serious criminal records, who are changing their identity to come into Canada. This all stems from the fact that the Liberals have not said, look, we have a process in place to welcome people to Canada. If you do not follow it, there are consequences to that.
Thank you. Numbers have been put forward to committee today by IRCC stating the total number of asylum claimants in various years. Can you provide the number of asylum claimants in those years that were made by people at official points of entry as opposed to unofficial points of entry?
We do have those numbers indeed. We can provide them.
When?
It'll probably come with a package of all the other data, I suspect.
Can you provide that immediately?
We'll do our
right
best.
now?
No, I cannot right now.
So you can't tell us how many asylum claimants were made, let's say, this year by illegal points of entry versus legal points of entry?
I may actually have that, Chair.
Oh, wow. At a briefing on this map, you don't. Oh, that's unfortunate. Of the number of people who have made asylum claims by through unofficial points of entry this year, how many have been ordered deported?
At this point, no such order has been issued because the process is not completed. Are we speaking specifically about l'école or in general?
For my question was for the number of all people who have made asylum claims through an illegal point of entry or an unofficial point of entry, how many have been deported?
So I'm aware of cases in British Columbia.
How many?
I believe it's 9, but we will provide those numbers to you.
Okay, thank you. Can you please provide the specific number of cases of people who have made asylum claims at an unofficial point of entry in 2017 that have been connected with criminality or suspected of criminality or have any sort of criminal flag associated with them?
We will provide that, yes.
Do you have that information right now?
I do not have it with me in the details that you're asking, but we will provide that information to you.
When will that be provided?
As soon as possible.
Thank you. Of the number of asylum claims that have been made in 2017, Mr. McDonald, I believe that you said that, to the response to one of my colleagues, that ebbs and flows are associated with visa regimes. In this year, how many asylum claims have been made by Mexican nationals?
Again, I don't have the Mexican number right at hand.
What numbers do you have?
No, I do not have the Mexican number at hand.
Can you please provide that to committee as soon as possible? How many staff within IRCC have been reallocated from different streams of processing to the new processing centers in Montreal? And what streams are they from?
Approximately, I would say 80 staff have been deployed from across Canada to the center at Guy Favreau. In addition to that, we have created back offices in various locations across Canada, and we have approximately a total of 40 staff working, helping the processing at Guy Favreau. We've, as Mr. McDonald pointed out, we have capacity within our resources, to divert individuals from one project to the other. So we took, for example, some people from the citizenship line, and we've asked them, to go and assist on the project. We've also taken people working on, for example, certain immigration lines, and we've asked them, to participate to the project.
Have the processing times for temporary foreign worker work permits increased in 2017 over 2016?
I don't have this information, but as Mr. McDonald has alluded to, we have reduced substantially the processing time for refugee claimants, to get work permits over the past few weeks.
Thank you. In the 2017-2018 immigration levels plan, there's a line item that says humanitarian and other. Would that be the line item where asylum claims would be projected?
No, Mr. Chair. The asylum claims would be projected under the protected status persons.
Okay, and how many were projected in that this year?
In 2017, the target is about 15,000.
Okay, and that is just specifically for asylum seekers, or does that also include other streams of refugees as well?
No, that's for the asylum seekers, and then we have a column called resettled refugees.
Okay.
Which is
so this year, just to be clear, and for the record, the government projected 15,000 asylum claimants in the Levels Plan, and last week in New York, the immigration minister is now projecting over 40,000. Is that correct?
Well, just a bit of precision. The protected persons of 15,000, that's the level anticipated of asylum claimants who would actually become protected persons in this year. It doesn't equate to the number of asylum claimants who might show up because the process.
But yet, so do we have that figure of how many asylum claims have been made versus how many have been approved this year?
We certainly have the figures of the number of asylum claimants who come in thus far, which is, I think, 32,000. But it's a staggered pace in terms of when you actually become a protected person. You don't become a protected person until the IRB actually makes the determination that you are a protected person.
Sure. There was one other area that sort of came to my attention that I was curious about. You were talking about expediting healthcare coverage for asylum claims that had been made at a legal port of entry. Is that being undertaken for other streams of refugees as well?
No, the discretion of the minister to do that is exclusively for those who cross through the Lacal situation. For most other asylum claimants across Canada, we are processing them either completely at the port of entry and they're issued their IFH certificate, or we are processing them inland within the 3-day window.
About 30 seconds left.
Great. And just to finish the thought of my colleague, Mr. McGuire, he was asking the RCMP about the number of outstanding deportation cases from asylum claims that have been rejected. Could you speak to those numbers?
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, I'd have to defer to CBSA for that question.
Sure, sorry.
And again, quickly, we will provide those numbers to you.
Ms. Rempel. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since the beginning of 2017, what percentage of asylum claims made by people illegally crossing the border between Canada and the U.S. have been processed?
I don't actually have the exact percentage for the entire year being processed. It often is moving with the volumes that are coming through.
And I am going to interrupt just because of time. Can you please table that number with committee? Can you also please table the percentage of claims that have been rejected? Thank you. Similarly, can you please table with committee the following information? With respect to border crossings occurring at unofficial points of entry since the beginning of 2017, can you please provide a full breakdown of costs associated with asylum claims made by people illegally crossing the border for winterized trailers installed at the U.S.-Canada border, perimeter fencing and lighting for winterized trailers, the use of Montreal's Olympic Stadium to house border crossers, the tent village built to house asylum seekers along the Canadian-U.S. border, any other temporary accommodations used to house asylum seekers crossing the border, any other costs associated with housing and supporting asylum seekers, including food, any relevant transfers made to provincial governments related to the increase in asylum seekers crossing the border, any relevant transfers to municipal governments related to the increase in asylum seekers crossing the border, any transportation provided to asylum seekers crossing the U.S.-Canada border, all costs associated with opening and operating the new floor and reception room at the Peel Street Joint Processing Centre that you alluded to, as well as the number of staff reallocated to the Peel Street Processing Centre and what streams of processing those staff have been reallocated from, as well as similar information for the processing facility that has been opened at Complexe Guy Favreau. Can that be tabled with the committee?
Yes, it will.
Thank you. When?
I'd have to look into the department. I think that's a lot of data, but we will do our best to do that as fast as possible.
An IRCC official stated that we are taking a number of proactive measures both in Canada and abroad to counter misinformation that has been circulating and ensuring everyone is aware of the facts about Canada's asylum system. This was an IRCC spokesperson, Hirsch Jaswal. Does a formal plan exist? Is there a formal departmental plan that has been written to communicate this information?
There is. We have a communications and an outreach plan that we are following.
Can you please table that with committee?
I will take that back, yes.
Thank you. Earlier this week, we heard that there was a CBC article that stated that Nigerian asylum claims were wanting to come to Canada, quote, because they were aware of the pipeline. What additional measures is IRCC taking to outreach into the broader international community that the asylum claim system is not a free ticket to Canada, quote?
We've done several things, the first of which is to look at our communications and outreach plan and determine the best way in which to reach the Nigerian diaspora population here, as well as in the United States, and as well back in Nigeria itself. Second, we are also liaising and working with our American colleagues. We have a mission overseas, as does other allied partners. So we've also gone back to our immigration program overseas to try and look at ways and ideas that we can reach populations.
Thank you.
It is not compassionate to tweet #Welcome to Canada and turn Canada's asylum system into a joke. His ego and his failure has put Canada's social programs and once sound immigration system in jeopardy. Will the Prime Minister designate the entire Canadian border as a technical official point of entry for the purpose of applying the Safe Third Country Agreement?
Mr. Speaker, this is the party that cut refugee health care, the people who are most vulnerable in our society. A measure that the Federal Court of Canada called cruel and unusual punishment, Mr. Speaker. We will take no lessons on refugee response. We are working very closely with Quebec. We've issued over 12,000 work permits to Quebec asylum seekers so that we minimize the pressure on provincial services. We have provided an additional $112 million for the settlement and integration of newcomers in Quebec. We will continue to work closely with Quebec, and I look forward to the meeting tonight.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's #Welcome to Canada tweet caused tens of thousands of illegal border crossers to flood into Canada from the United States of America and claim asylum. We also know that there's no end in sight. Border agents are expecting upwards of 400 illegal border crossers per day this summer. The Prime Minister has failed to manage the border. Will the Prime Minister tell Canadians if he has any plan to stop the flow of illegal border crossers?
Honourable Minister of Immigration and Refugees.
We are fully in control over this issue. We have a task force, an intergovernmental task force on irregular migration. We had our 9th meeting last night with different provincial representatives. We have made the necessary investments in speeding up work permits for asylum seekers so they don't we minimize the impacts on provincial social services. What is irresponsible is cutting funding for CBSA and pretend that you care about the border. What is irresponsible is cutting funding for the IRB and care about refugee processing. What is irresponsible is having toxic relationships with provinces. We will...
The Honourable Member for Calgary Rose Hill.
At illegal border crossers. Over $200 million just to process their paperwork. Millions of dollars to construct tent cities. Millions of dollars to turn Olympic Stadium into a refugee camp. And all this has done is made the problem worse. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister had the audacity to tell a veteran who served our country that he was asking for more than we could give. Why is this the Prime Minister's priority instead of stopping the flow of illegal border crossers?
Justin Trudeau needs to manage Canada's borders. We have watched for over a year and a half tens of thousands of people illegally cross the border from the United States into Canada, and they have done nothing except throw hundreds of millions of dollars at the problem, which has only made it worse. We're expecting over 400 people per day this summer to enter into Canada. I tabled a motion in the House of Commons today, full support with the Conservative Party of Canada and our leader Andrew Scheer, to get Justin Trudeau to come up with a plan to manage the borders. In fact, we even put forward some suggestions on how to do that. I want you to watch my speech. It's a little bit longer, but it outlines the problem, it outlines what they can do to fix it, and certainly it calls upon the government to act. Watch this.
Ms. Rempel, seconded by Mr. Paulus, moves that, given the government's failure to address the crisis created by the influx of thousands of illegal border crossers traveling across our southern border between ports of entry, that the agencies responsible for dealing with this crisis have found gaps in security screening for newly arrived refugee claimants, as well as a backlog in both scheduled hearings and carrying out deportation orders, and that this trend is expected to increase over the summer months. The House call on the government to A, ensure the agencies responsible for our borders are properly equipped so that they can continue to do their jobs effectively, and that those arriving at Canadian borders go through the appropriate processes. B, admit the Prime Minister's irresponsibility of tweeting #welcome to Canada to those seeking to enter Canada through illegal means. C, take responsibility for the massive social services costs burdening the provincial governments. And D, table in the House no later than May 11, 2018, a plan to, 1, stop the influx of people illegally entering Canada from the United States, 2, take appropriate measures to handle those who have already claimed asylum.
Chair, to the Minister of Public Safety, how many people who have illegally crossed the border from the United States into Canada and subsequently claimed asylum since January 2017 have been removed from Canada?
In response to specific statistical questions, Mr. Chair, I wouldn't have those numbers with me today, but I would be more than happy to examine the question in the record of the meeting and provide the answer numerically to the committee.
Mr. Chair, both ministers and the Prime Minister have put this particular aspect, the removal aspect, in the front of their platforms on this. The fact that the minister does not have this number at committee, I would suggest he has it. I would suggest he's hiding it, and I would ask him if he would be able to table this number with committee by the end of this week.
I will endeavour to answer the question as rapidly as possible with full statistical information, Mr. Chair, and I would point out that with the additional resources that have been provided in the last budget,
I have a point of order
in the last budget,
I hate to interrupt
we will be able to accelerate the process.
Mr. Chair, I find this quite difficult because I think Ms. Rempel is suggesting that the minister is not being forthright, and in fact she's suggesting that he's being deceiving, and I believe that's unparliamentary and is uncalled for in this committee meeting.
She has the right to do that.
I would say we continue to me. I'm not going to prejudge that, but yes.
I would like, on the same point of order, the opportunity to respond. Mr. Chair, the ministers have put forward the removal aspect as one of the key platform elements in terms of their response to this issue. That the Minister of Public Safety does not know in front of a parliamentary committee how many people have been removed from Canada in this for a parliamentary hearing.
I'm going to interrupt you to say that I believe we're now to debate, and I welcome you to continue your questioning.
No, Mr. Chairman, she's entitled to respond to his comments.
No, once we've moved into a debate,
It's not a debate. She's simply responding.
And I have responded that I'm not considering
You're cutting
this
her
point
off.
of order.
You're out of order, Mr. Chairman.
I'm happy to be challenged on that.
I'm challenging you.
All right.
Wait, point of order, Mr. Chair. Just point of clarification. So you are ruling my colleague's aspersion out of order?
Yes, that's out of order, and I would invite you to continue your questioning.
Thank you.
But if you'd like to pursue the challenge, that is also okay.
No, you've ruled him out of order. That's fine.
Thank you.
Could I make one point, Mr. Chair?
No, Mr. Chair, I would like to continue my questions.
Obviously, she's only interested in disinformation.
Mr. Chair, point of order. If the minister would like to table the amount of people who have been removed from this country, who have claimed asylum after illegally entering Canada from the United States since the start of 2017, I would be happy to have that information. However, for the minister to sit here and try and waste my time that I have for questions by saying it's disinformation because he doesn't have this information, I find mildly irritating and somewhat insulting. So I would invite him, if he would like to make a remark, that it would be that specific number, otherwise to let me pursue my line of questioning, as is my right.
I would just remind the committee that it is not our job on the committee to evaluate the quality of an answer. We are to ask our questions. I believe the minister has made an undertaking to the committee to provide those numbers, and I believe that he has made that commitment. I heard it, and I would invite the member continue.
Mr. Chair, as I understand it, the question covered
order, Mr.
two fiscal years. I want to ensure I have complete data over 2 fiscal years.
All right, Ms. Rempel.
Yes, the minister has the ability to read the minutes of the meeting, as do all of us. Mr. Chair.
Which is what I said I would do, Mr. Chair.
I would like to continue with my line of questions. The minister's department had said that they were going to provide this committee with the exact lines of service that 800 staff members have been redirected to the border from to the Roxham Road issue from other lines. They have not provided that information. When does the minister anticipate providing that information to committee?
Mr. Chair, those are undertakings made previously by officials in their appearances before the committee, and I understand the requested information is available and will be tabled shortly with the committee.
When?
Either today or tomorrow, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Will the minister also provide a similar breakdown of the amount of RCMP and number of RCMP officers that have been redirected to the Roxham Road border crossing in terms of details on which lines of activity they work in? Essentially, I'm trying to get an understanding of where resources have been redirected from to deal with the Roxham Road issue.
So to be clear, Mr. Chair, the question is with respect to the same information that was earlier requested of CBSA. The member is now making a request for parallel information for the RCMP.
That's correct.
Commissioner Lucky is here. She's heard the request, and I'm sure she'll respond to it to the very best of her ability as soon as that data can be
Thank you very much.
The Prime Minister has issued 12,500 expedited work permits for people who have entered Canada illegally from the United States in the last year alone. There are hundreds of thousands of people, including new Canadians, who are out of work or could be out of work and are trying to make ends meet. Planned, orderly migration grows our economy. What is happening at the Quebec-U.S. border is not planned, orderly, fair, or compassionate. Why won't the Prime Minister close the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
The House of Conservatives never understood a very simple thing about immigration, that investment follows talent. They didn't make the necessary investments in immigration processing. Let's stick to the numbers. Parents and grandparents had to wait years under that party to come to Canada. Spouses and children were kept apart for years under that party. Privately sponsored refugees were kept for years apart under that party. We inherited a 50,000 backlog in privately sponsored refugees. And yes, they lack compassion because they cut refugee health care.
The Minister has moved over 80 full-time employees from processing applications who are trying to legally emigrate to Canada to process work permits for people entering Canada illegally from the United States. Yet we know that LGBTQI plus refugees waiting in UN camps wait for years to come to Canada under this government. How is it compassionate to send resources to prioritize the applications of illegal border crossers from the United States of America while persecuted LGBTI refugees have to wait?
Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, promoting the rights and dignity of LGBTQ2 people at home and abroad has been a priority for this government. What was their record under that party, Mr. Speaker? They were forced by the opposition to put back LGBTQ2 rights in the Citizenship Guide after they removed those rights and a mention of those rights under the Citizenship Act. We have quadrupled the number of privately sponsored refugees so that we can identify the most vulnerable refugees in the world, including LGBTQ2 communities. We have funded the Rainbow Refugee Society so that more LGBTQ2 refugees can be brought to Canada, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Calgary, Nose Hill.
Government that was the first to include LGBTQI rights in Canada's Citizenship Guide. Mr. Speaker, there is one line of immigration that this government has managed to reduce to 0 days for wait time, and that's for people who are illegally crossing the border from the safe country that is the United States. Meanwhile, it takes 30 months for someone to immigrate on humanitarian and compassionate grounds legally in Canada. Why has the minister redirected 80 staff from processing the applications of legal border crossers to those illegally entering the country from the United States?
Minister.
Was it? How many people are going to cross the border illegally from the United States into Canada this year and claim asylum? It takes a plan to bring humanitarian immigration to Canada. We need to ensure that there are resources for integration, which this government is not doing. We need to ensure that the world's most vulnerable are protected. You can't do that without anticipating numbers. How many people is the Prime Minister anticipating will cross the border illegally from the U.S. into Canada and claim asylum this year?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, the member opposite wants to hear about our plan. We have actually engaged with communities in the United States, in Southern California, in Florida, to talk about the rigor with which we apply our immigration system and to ensure that they know that regardless of how many come to Canada, we will always be able to apply the entirety of our immigration system, of our rules, of our laws to any arrival in this country. That's what Canadians need to know. Regardless of expected or unexpected arrivals, we have a system that is strong and robust enough to deal with it. And the fear that the Conservatives are trying to spread is not helping Canadians.
The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I intend to use my full time for questions. Does the minister believe that once people have reached the United States of America, they are fleeing from persecution?
The Honourable Minister of Citizenship.
I thank the honourable member for the question. Under the Safe Third Country Agreement with the United States and the expert opinion of the UNHCR in Canada, as well as our own analysis, the United States continues to meet its international obligations with respect to its domestic asylum policy.
For Calgary.
Good afternoon. I'm encouraged that we will be having further meetings this summer to look at the issue of the border crossing crisis at Roxham Road and the impacts that it's having on provincial social programs, as well as the fact that the Liberal government does not have a plan on this issue. What I was very discouraged about, however, was to hear some of the rhetoric that came out of Liberal members' mouths. The word hysterical, the assertion that the government has a plan, I think just belies the fact that the government is not, federal government is not taking this seriously. I was also disappointed that the government side did not agree to have more robust time meetings with each of the ministers that they've brought. I think if we do have a meeting where 3 federal ministers spend an hour in the room, that's kind of a mockery of the process. So I'll look very eagerly to the chair of the committee to ensure that opposition members have time to ask questions. I also intend to invite some of our provincial counterparts to testify at these meetings, and I certainly hope that the government side and the government chair of the committee will allow provincial counterparts to testify.
Ms. Rempel, we're back to this basic point. What is the solution? I mean, the Safe Third Country Agreement seems to have the government boxed in, that they are concerned about offending that agreement if they start deporting people who cross the border irregularly back to the United States. If the Americans won't renegotiate the agreement, what do you do?
Well, the Conservative Party has suggested a number of legislative options that we believe that Canada could undertake within its own purview to see the Safe Third Country Agreement apply to the entire length of the border. The unfortunate reality is that, how long has this been going on for now? 18 months. And this is not something that the government has brought up in a committee study, in the House of Commons. The reality is the government has not examined, and I assert that the government has not examined all options to enforce the agreement. And certainly there's no indication that they've even asked the Americans if they're willing to renegotiate it. So a lot of what we're talking about here in terms of some of the things you brought up is speculation, because we don't know, because they haven't done it yet. And to me that's very irresponsible. But there's another side to the coin here as well. The reality is both myself and my colleague mentioned today, over 30,000 people have entered the country via this method. And now we have to talk about what we're doing because they're people, right? Like, these aren't just numbers. And that's often with this government, what I've noticed is there's another side of the equation that often gets forgotten, and that is people's lives. So, you know, I'm thinking this morning about somebody who has entered the country via this method, who is not going to have their asylum claim heard for years, and is sitting in a dormitory in Toronto facing an August 9th eviction notice with no plan. You know, I'm bemused by the fact that the government has been colloquially referring to a system, an organized system of putting people on buses from homeless shelter to hotel to homeless shelter to rink as a triage system. You know, how are we going to process their claims? How are we going to support social subsidized housing? How are we going to, you know, support social programs? These are all questions that require a plan and a cost. And I think where a lot of Canadians are asking for this plan, it's because out of compassion, and it's also because the reality is that when you're expending resources on prioritizing people who are entering the country via this particular method, there is an impact. There's an opportunity cost. There's an impact on people who are languishing in UNHCR camps. There's an impact on people who are trying to process their applications to enter the country legally, and we don't have a plan. So, you know, today I think the first step is holding the government to account to produce a tangible plan. Both, to me, I think, to restore order to the asylum system. You know, the one thing that the government has said is they've asserted that the Safe Third Country Agreement still applies. So if it still applies, logic dictates that it should apply to the entire border. I need to understand if they have any intention of doing that, and if they don't, then we need to understand what the projections are for the number of people who will be entering Canada via this method, and how the government plans to budget and pay for processing, for housing, for social welfare programs, and then, of course, per Justin Trudeau's own minister's admission, eventual removal orders for those that don't have valid asylum claim. Where are those 800
public
people
safety
going
and
to
with
go?
municipal officials in the City of Toronto.
Where are those 800 people going to go?
I'm aware that plans have already been made to move those individuals into quite appropriate housing in hotels around the GTA.
For how long will they be staying in hotels?
Well, that really depends on their integration into the community and the processes that are currently underway.
How long do you anticipate that they will stay in hotels?
Well, again, we see a transition of those individuals out, and I think the situation is being very effectively
people in
managed.
Hotels?
I'd refer to senior officials on the actual cost.
Do you think that it's reasonable to house 800 people in hotels? Do you think it's reasonable to house 800 people in hotels?
I think it's reasonable to make sure that people have adequate shelter as they work through the due process that is required in their review.
Ms. Rempel, out of respect for the interpreters, they're very difficult for them to interpret in our two official languages if they're speaking over. So if there could be
Mr. Chair. Minister Blair, would you characterize housing someone in a hotel for an indeterminate period as adequate housing?
They're undergoing due process in the review of their claim for asylum, and in that period, I think this is an appropriate way to ensure that they are adequately housed and in a safe and healthful environment. It is a contingency while they work through those processes, and in my opinion, it is appropriate.
I'll ask your officials then to table with the committee the total projected cost for housing people who have illegally crossed the border into Canada from the United States and subsequently claimed asylum for the next 5 years. Yes?
Yes, noted.
Thank you. My questions will relate to the system that has been put in place to bus people who have crossed at Roxham Road and claimed asylum. This is the system that the government is referring to as the triage system. So earlier in testimony today, we've heard that the government does not want to close the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement. And then we've had my colleague use the word the new normal in terms of the particular situation that is happening at Roxham Road. So my question relates to the budgetary efficacy and efficacy of the government's system. How many people is the government projecting will cross at Roxham Road for the remainder of 2018 and then into 2019 that will subsequently be bused and require temporary shelter?
So I will refer those questions to the departments that manage those questions so you can get specific answers to it. And the answer, and the new normal I referred to was displacement of population, not the situation at the border.
I'm assuming you are here in your capacity as parliamentary secretary because you're supposed to be talking about the efficacy of your, quote, triage system, yet you cannot tell us how many people you are expecting to have to triage in the next year. Is that correct?
Well, what we're seeing is that numbers crossing the border at that particular point has dropped now to below 40.
Well, actually, year over year,
and as a result
from
of that,
June of last year
the number
to
is
June of
fluctuating
this year,
and thankfully getting smaller.
It's increased year over year. So the graph is going like that.
Factually, that's incorrect.
So you can't tell us how many people are going to cross the border. So how can you project how many hotel rooms will be needed?
That is the challenge of having an emergency shelter system, which is at beyond surge capacity.
But you've said it's the
and
new
so the new normal requires us not to operate shelters at 90% capacity in normal times because the new normal is displaced populations.
Are going to be required over the next year? Because you've said that there will be more installment payments to provinces, and these installments are not part of the budgetary processes. And as parliamentarians, our role is to question government expenditures and their efficacy. So how many more hotel spots are you estimating will be required, and over what time period?
So currently the City of Toronto's homeless population and shelter population is currently...
I'll clarify. Specifically
currently
for people crossing at Roxham Road.
I'll give you an explanation. Currently the shelter capacity in the City of Toronto stands at about 6,400 people, half of whom are children. That number has been holding steady at about 5,000 over the last 7 years. The way to create shelter capacity.
I have limited
the
time.
way to create shelter capacity in the system is to get those people out of the shelter system into permanent housing. That's the $40 billion national housing strategy. And then you have a set budget at the City of Toronto to deal with emergency housing.
I understand you're trying to talk the clock. That's fine, but we're not getting the numbers that we need here.
I was just giving you the numbers.
So the reality is that your government is coming out and making announcement on funding with no numbers attached to it. How many people, for how long? We can't assess, even though I might not agree with my colleague here on how, we need to be able to assess if this is the best and most compassionate way to deal with people who are entering this country at Roxham Road, now that, as you've said, this is the new normal.
That's not what I said.
So,
what I said was displacement of populations inside Canada is the new normal.
To my colleague's point, if you've come to this meeting without these figures, then I don't understand why you're here.
But you'd have to stop asking the question for me to answer.
I would ask, given the amount of commentary that was colorful that you had around the provincial government, who has been in office for 2 weeks, are you planning to run for the leadership of the Ontario Liberal Party?
The answer to the question that I think you're trying to ask is how do we get to a system whereby the emergency housing system, which is the most expensive and least humane way to deal with any individual, let alone their immigration status, how do we move from that into a more robust housing program? That will save cities money, provinces money, but more importantly, it'll save people's lives.
Hotels for how long, and how much it's going to
cost
the
average stay in the hotel.
Taxpayer. And to my colleague's question, if this is the best way to deal with people that are coming into the country this way, and whether or not Canada has the capacity to successfully integrate the amount of people that you have allowed to come into this country by failing to close
is that the system will be sustained as overwhelmed going forward.
We are sitting here in the middle of the summer for meetings, and you have provided no context, no answers, and no statistics for us. You are going to be coming out, and you said you're going to have more installment payments, and parliamentarians here outside of the budgetary process have less information than we did before. Your Prime Minister hired a minister who doesn't even know what his job is. Are you reporting into him?
I report to the Minister of Social Development, and the question you've asked us about statistics. The question you've asked us about statistics, and what I'm telling you.
This is the second time that our colleague has wavered from the focus of the meeting. You know, Mr. Blair's job is not really relevant to the agenda. Neither is the Ontario Liberal Party.
Actually, because point of order, response on the point of order outside of my time. The Prime Minister has appointed a minister to be in charge of this issue. And this morning, Mr. Chair, he said, I don't know what my job is. Then we have a parliamentary secretary who's sitting here says, I don't know how many people are coming in. You'd have to ask the Department of Immigration. This morning, the minister said, the CBSA and the RCMP don't report into me. What we're seeing here is completely relevant to the issue at hand, there's no plan from this government to manage the situation. There is no plan that parliamentarians can look at the adequacy of whether or not these budgetary expenses are adequate, if they're compassionate, and on what projections they're being made on. That is
quite
the
clearly
data
a
we were
plan.
trying to get here today, and we've had minister after parliamentary secretary come woefully underprepared to provide this data to the committee. It is in scope, and I will continue these questions.
Thank you. Please continue.
Thank you. Mr. Vaughan, how many people do you project will need housing after crossing Roxham Road for the next 18 months?
What we're seeing is a decline in the numbers, and therefore we believe and hope that
10,000,
that situation, the
20,000.
situation
That is
peaked, which means
the end of the time. We now.
Mr. Speaker, the minister has gotten up and talked about the hundreds of millions of dollars that this government has spent on illegal border crossers. Yet, from January and August in 2017, the numbers were 13,221. January to August this year, it was 14,125. The problem is getting worse. There's only one way this is going to get solved. That's by closing the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement.
Right.
Has the minister done anything of import, like asking the Americans to close the loophole in this agreement?
Honourable Minister of Border Security.
Mr. Speaker, as the Minister for Border Security, I have been tasked with leading the engagement with the United States on the Safe Third Country Agreement. To that end, I have communicated with Secretary Nielsen and asked that government to engage with us on this important issue. There have been some discussions to date, and that will continue.
Honourable Member. The Honourable Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
I'll summarize that as no. Mr. Speaker, the member for Scarwood-Gilwood said the following. People who have come to the conclusion that these people, illegal border crossers, are not refugees and they should be returned sooner rather than later. A Conservative government would close the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement and remove those expeditiously who do not have a legal reason to be in Canada. Mr. Speaker, that's very simple. It's what Canadians want. That is a Canadian thing to ask for. When will this government close the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement?
Honourable Minister of Border Security.
Mr. Speaker, Canada has a long tradition and proud tradition of providing protection to those who need it most by providing refuge to the world's most vulnerable people. And at the same time, we must ensure the security of our communities and the integrity of our border. The Immigration and Refugee Protection Act requires the ongoing review of all designated third countries to ensure that the conditions that led to their designation continue. And as I have already indicated, I have reached out to Secretary Nielsen to discuss issues related to irregular migration and the shared border, including ways in which we might enhance the Safe Third Country Agreement.
So the
Honourable Minister of Border Security.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's very important to add some facts into this discussion. The member opposite mentioned that almost there's a percentage of these irregular border crossers who have American citizenship. Mr. Speaker, they're infants. They're babies and toddlers that have been born very recently in the United States to asylum seekers. And surely the member opposite is not suggesting that we tear these infants from their mother's arms and incarcerate them into cages.
The Honourable Order. The Honourable Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I would love to have a debate about the integrity and the well-functioning of our immigration system. What just came out of the minister's mouth was beyond reproach, Mr. Speaker. We should be trying to come up with a solution to bring back the integrity of our asylum claim system. Will the minister apologize for the rhetoric and hyperbole that he just put forward in this House of Commons? And will he close the loophole in Canada's Safe Third Country Agreement?
Apologize for standing up for children, for standing up for families, for standing up for a compassionate response to those who are fleeing persecution and danger. Mr. Speaker, we have a proud tradition in this country of being a welcoming country to those who are legitimately seeking refuge. And we will continue to provide and uphold Canadian law and Canadian values in that system. To suggest for a moment that the people should be removed simply because, as toddlers, they happen to hold American citizenship by virtue of where they were born is...
The Honourable Member for
maybe we should just cut the baloney. So you are sitting here, Minister, in an invented position with bureaucrats that don't report to you, but nonetheless have the misfortune of working with you. And we are in the final days of a parliament where we've seen your government purposefully go out, and again, regardless of your opinion on the American president, poke the Americans in the eye with #Welcome to Canada, then allow 40,000 people to illegally enter the country, and then claim asylum while saying that the Safe Third Country Agreement upholds, but then putting in place a permanent tent city, busing programs into the GTA, spending hundreds of millions of dollars on hotels for people that likely, by your own colleagues' admissions, don't have valid asylum claims. Then you proceeded to vilify any Canadian who said, you know what, maybe people who are in upstate New York don't have the same level of persecution as somebody coming from northern Iraq, and maybe we shouldn't be spending hundreds of millions of dollars on hotels and creating pulls into our system by creating years-long backlogs. You know, you vilified anybody. Your colleague, the Minister of Immigration, the Prime Minister himself, tried to score cheap political points with #Welcome to Canada, then un-Canadian questioning, you're racist if you question this, inflamed tensions. You know, you yourself sat here and you blustered, we can't call it illegal. And then you proceeded to spend hundreds of millions of more dollars on this program. You ramped up the rhetoric until we got close to an election. And then all of a sudden we have Division 16 in the Budget Implementation Act, measures that have been routinely panned by virtually every immigration professional in Canada, not likely to uphold any sort of court challenge whatsoever. And frankly, people will testify during these hearings that are likely to have even more of an administrative backlog and burden on the system. You then proceeded, and your colleague did, to blame the situation on Stephen Harper, which, good on you. You've got to do what you've got to do as being paid to be a communicator. But the reality is that you've inherited a 10,000 case backlog, which of course was brought down after a massive backlog. This is the IRB after a previous Liberal government. And we're now at 71,000 case backlog, according to the Auditor General today. A 71,000 case backlog at the IRB. You said that the system is fast. So fast is 5 years plus to have a refugee claim hearing. You also added to the backlog by lifting the visa requirement on Mexico when your government had not done a formal review of the system. We're now seeing, I believe in the last 2 months, it was over 1,500, I think, claims from Mexico. We know that the determination rate of those claims of validity will be about 22%. The average caseload right now, or the average level is about 55%. So we know that many of these are bogus claims. So your government, one could argue, has managed the asylum system when I believe that we should have a strong asylum system. We should be allowing people into the country who have legitimate needs of persecutions, but you've managed this like it's this joke for votes. Fast, come on. Really? Stephen Harper's fault? After you've got, when we form government in October, we're going to have to clean up a 120,000 case backlog left by you. And now, at the end of the dying days of this parliament, all of a sudden when you see polling that your mismanagement of this is somehow unpopular because people are going, this isn't fair, all of a sudden now you throw something into an omnibus budget bill, which, I had a colleague on this committee had to fight to get it parsed out to review here. We only had one piece of legislation come through this committee in the entirety of this parliament, and it's not even going to work. And it's probably illegal and unconstitutional. You haven't even picked up the phone to the Americans. Literally, your department sat here and we asked them, when are you has the government given you any direction to implement closing the loopholes in the Safe Third Country Agreement? The answer, just, Minister, in case you weren't briefed, was nope. That's because you guys didn't even pick the phone up. You're like, wow, I don't know if the Americans can do it. You didn't even pick up the phone and go, hey, we have a problem here. Maybe we should deal with this. No, you had your foreign affairs minister go sit on a stage in the middle of a trade negotiation with the American president, again, regardless of how you feel about it, compared to Bashar al-Assad and the North Korean dictator. Maybe not the best thing to do in the middle of a trade agreement while you're trying to negotiate asylum system reform. Like, this is incompetence. Like, I've seen a lot of incompetence, but this is incompetence that has a human face, because the hundreds of millions of dollars that you've spent on the baloney that you're peddling is costing Canadian taxpayers. It's costing people who are trying to come into this country legally, because you're rediverting resources or redirecting resources to people who are abusing our system, and you're raising taxes on Canadians. Like, this is not how to manage an immigration system. And then the government, to add insult to injury, hires you. They hire you to be a communicator on the file. You don't have authority over any of these bureaucrats. You don't have the ability to bring a memorandum to cabinet or instruct the RCMP on this sort of thing. You're a glorified mouthpiece for the Prime Minister on this stuff. It's just, this has real implications that you guys have bungled so badly, that it's embarrassing. And you should be held to account in the fall for it. We're just tired of it. This is a sham. This is a joke. So my question to you is this. Are you comfortable with your personal legacy? You've had a long career, Minister, breaking Canada's immigration system for you and the Liberal Party's political gain?
Thank you very much for the question. I'm very comfortable. The job I was given included taking steps to more efficiently and effectively manage the issue of irregular migration. And as I've already advised this committee,
I guess I'll take that as a yes, and I hope voters hold you account to that.
If you don't want the rest of the answer, Ms. Rempel, I'll defer to the chair.
I don't know.
You have about 25 seconds.
I just think the answer to that is yes. And I feel bad for you, Bill. I really do. I do. So I wish you the best after October. Thank you. I'm done.
Ms. Kwan.
So today, after several years, well over $1 billion spent on people who had already reached the safety of upstate New York, illegally crossed the border, and then subsequently claimed asylum in Canada, including hotel costs, just the litany of it is endless. Today, after saying that it couldn't be done, Bill Blair and Justin Trudeau announced that they would be temporarily closing the illegal border crossing at Roxham Road. I don't know why we couldn't have done this 3 years ago. This is just ridiculous. But at least some action has been taken, and rest assured, we will be holding the government to account to make sure that they make good on this promise today. Working hard for you. Have a great day.